Future Scenarios, which was published in 2008. And could you say in your own words, describe a bit this central scheme that you published in that book, which I think is extremely enlightening to analyze the situation today. Could you describe for us that drawing?
Yes, well, the context for this is that my work from the beginning, as a result of the limits to growth, was informed by some view of the future being a form of energy descent, that the net energy available to support humanity would contract. And as a result of that, everything would be restructured in one way or another, rather than it being some sort of ideological choice or whatever. All of those ideological, cultural, and ways of living would be forced to change as a result of that contraction, rather than the constant expansion of energy. So this energy basis of Odum, that is the primary driver of systems in collective form, was central to that. And in trying to understand the diversity of how energy descent might emerge, I thought that was very important to sort of try and work with that for a number of reasons. Firstly, I'd observed that almost all thinking about the future tended to be focused on what I called a techno-explosion future, greater energy, greater control over nature, all sorts of different forms of that. And then there was a counterpoint to that of extreme collapse, or the end of the world sort of view. And there was very little in the middle of what happens with a sort of more gradual but continuous contraction. Even though we have a lot of historical evidence of such things like the Roman Empire, for example, which was that pattern. So that's the sort of precursor to trying to understand what the primary drivers were and uncertainties in what might shape different future scenarios of energy descent. And I came to the conclusion that the decline in the primary high quality fossil fuel energy in the form of conventional oil, and its uncertainty about when it would peak and at what rate it would decline, was a big uncertainty. And that the other driver, which is obviously closely related to fossil fuel, is the rate and severity in the onset of climate change. So rather than that being a certainty as a result of all the complex modeling and science, still huge amounts of uncertainty about whether that would be relatively benign and slow in its onset, or more extreme and rapid. And that then created 4 combinations. So these are obviously in classic scenario planning language. These are not choices we make. These are situations that emerge beyond our control, and whether we're thinking about that as individuals or as communities or nation states even, that although both of these are affected by human activity, the outcomes are not really something we have necessarily direct control over, but they are influenced by what humans might do. And so in that, I saw the 2 left scenarios, green tech and brown tech, were less severe or extreme, and the other 2, Earth Steward and Lifeboat, were more extreme. And I suppose the element in trying to describe the characteristics that would emerge, I was suggesting that the sort of organizational structures that would emerge would actually reflect the energy base. For example, in the green tech scenario, with a net reduction of energy, but it being slow from the fossil side and the climate being relatively benign, that agriculture and forestry and other aspects by which humans gained their needs from nature would continue to more or less work. But because total energy is contracting, the relative importance of agriculture and forestry and fishing and all of these different ways would be larger, whereas they've been very small in a world dominated by fossil fuel. So that would mean that, again, these energy sources from nature in agriculture and forestry are distributed across landscape, whereas fossil resources are concentrated in holes in the ground, as are also the mineral ore bodies that need to go with that as energy sources. And as in the photo, the renewable energies that would be developed in response to that declining energy from fossil fuel and the climate imperative are themselves also distributed rather than concentrated, and that would lead to economic development that was more distributed than our current city-centric concentration, and that through that, politics and economy would actually reflect that energetic structure with relatively harsh economic conditions in a lot of cities, and in a lot of rural environments, those who controlled those distributed resources, even if still going through some sort of energy descent, would be relatively more affluent or powerful. So that would create a regional centric economic and governance structure. So that's an example of how that basic energetic structure would affect what we mostly think of as being a product of different ideologies or different human values that come to the fore.
David, we are going to take about 15-minute break. It's the rule.
Yeah. Yes, good idea.
A 15-minute break, and then we will continue. Okay?
Yep.
So see you in a quarter of an hour.
Yep.
So we restart our conversation with this diagram, which is here. And in a way, it understands, it helps us understand, I think, what you started saying when describing the originality and compass of the Club of Rome's, the Limits to Growth report. Because you could say that we have two today, I think, intergovernmental panels on climate, on biodiversity, and they are both of them investigating the vertical arrow, or specific dimensions of the vertical arrow here, which could be, I think, globally described as the progressive degradation of the conditions of life on the planet, either slow or fast. But the Limits to Growth report combined that first arrow, which was called pollution, basically, in one of the big variables of the model, with at least another huge one, which is non-renewable resources, be they energetic or material, metals, rare earth. And in a way, this horizontal arrow could be, I think, described as the power that humans have at their disposal to transform the world, adapt it, including to the consequences of the other one, etc. So in a way, it is, yes, crossing those two things. We don't have any, I think we have an international energy agency, but we don't have anything like these huge political international efforts, put intergovernmental panel, or you name it, that would investigate these non-renewable resources and make scenarios in the future. Do we have that, David?
No, well, the main problem is that there's not an intellectual scientific basis for measuring and evaluating both non-renewable and renewable resources in the amount of net energy that they provide to support humanity's so far rising complexity. Because that complexity, and whether we see that in terms of the internet or many, many other manifestations of complexity, all require more net energy. So our ability to control and manipulate nature, to manage all of the problems of ecological overshoot, all require more energy. And of course, economists have no structural framework for dealing with that. And in terms of ecological energetics, it's been a tiny field until fairly recently. And within that field, there was a tragedy really in the early 80s, where those using what I believe was the most sophisticated methodology, that of Howard Odum, sort of lost the conceptual fight over how to measure net energy. So that what I predicted in the 90s is that once we hit global oil peak and the climate crisis, there would be this substantial intellectual confusion and fight about what was the net energy return of different sources of energy, including modern renewables. So that battle is going on, but it's a battle of theory in attempt to predict what will happen in the larger term. So this occurs in relation to, is the 100% renewable energy substitution for fossil fuels technically possible, practically implementable in a timeline that can address the climate crisis? And is it then sustainable in the long term? Or is it just a flourishing expression of fossil fuel wealth in itself, of embodied fossil fuel wealth? So there is debate around these things, but it's so confused and in such a difficult context of invested interests, who have deep commitment, not just on the fossil fuel side, but increasingly on the huge renewable energies, where people are very ideologically committed that they can project this pathway of growth and transformation without the need for massive reduction, without the need for simplification, what Nat Hagens calls the great simplification that's coming if you don't have the net energy.
In a subsequent essay to Future Scenario, which was published, I think, a couple of years after on your site, and is called Money versus Fossil Energy, you deepened away your thinking about that and insisted a lot. You basically explained that there is two opinions or ideology about what is the source of wealth and development. You could say on the one side, the realists and materialists who think that the origin of wealth is actually in the ground, the physiocrats in a way, fossil energy stuff, etc. And the others who are maybe more numerous today, who think that it's human genius, human capacity to, let's say, overcome the apparent limits of things. Could you elaborate a bit on that? And you're actually saying that it's, in your view, even more important than the difference of ideologies between collectivists and right and left, in a way. Could you tell us that? This is what this little diagram that you published in that essay summarizes.
Yes, I'm not sort of minimizing the importance of this very significant ideological divide about the individual versus the collective, and this tension that has existed in all human societies about the needs of the collective and the needs of the individual that we can think of as a simple left-right political spectrum in some form or other. But this other idea that two ideas about the sources of wealth being nature, and not just fossil resources, but in fact the precursors to that in fertile land, forests, the resources of renewable nature, so that for example, the feudal lords were connected enough to their environment that they understood their wealth and power wasn't just from their political cunning or how smart they were, but how much food their peasants could produce and how much good timber there was in their forests. They understood that, but then mercantile elites, with the development of capitalism and further removal from their sources of sustenance and power, became more focused on human creativity as a source of wealth. And we can think of this, the emergence of the Enlightenment ideas and certainly of capitalism, and for that matter of socialism too, that humans actually create wealth. And the pinnacle of all the different groups that believed in this were those who believed that money was the masterful human creation that created wealth. So we can see how there is some truth in both of these views, and the seed of that is in permaculture as well, in Mollison's emphasis on the yield is only limited by the imagination, whereas my tend to focus, my tendency to focus on the idea that there's no free lunch, that everything depends on some energetic possibility to come about. So the interplay between these in the creation of our world, between the miners, the engineers, and the military people who sought to control the important holes in the ground that provided wealth, and then the bankers and the diplomats and the social justice advocates, but most centrally the bankers who managed that ultimate masterful creation of money, that magic of money, that those two sides of our civilization worked in unity together, even though they had very different views of what was the source of wealth. And that gradually, as the civilization is reaching its limits, they are now more fighting each other. And so I was seeing in that essay this battle epitomized in the big energy companies and the big energy nations like Russia and Saudi Arabia, pitted against the huge banks and the IMF and these organizational structures that were actually more favorable to the climate agenda, that they thought the through this huge creativity, we could overcome those limits. And so I saw that, you know, that is a sort of a political battle that was going on within our nations and within the world.
Yeah. Then in 2014, you